Welcome back to Fresh Economic Thinking. Special guest today, Paul Frijters. You might recognize that name if you're a fan of Game of Mates or Rigged, the book we co-authored about grey corruption in Australia. So, longtime friend Paul is back to talk to the podcast. Thanks for coming, Paul.
Great to be on the show again, Cameron. Lovely to talk to people in Australia again.
And terrific. So, Paul's dialing in all the way from Belgium. I'll put some links to Academia Libera Mentis, Paul's new education institute. I don't know what the best word is, but I always think of it as X-Men. You go to the castle and you do intensive training. So we want to talk about the war in Iran and how to make sense of it today, which is something Paul and I have been talking back and forth about the last few weeks. But I want to maybe kick off, Paul, before I get your views on why should people take your views as an economist, academic, sitting there in the castle in Belgium seriously about this? Do you have special insights? Do you have economic or social insights or concepts that lead you to think differently to others?
Um, why? I guess if you don't know me, then you have no reason to take me more seriously than anybody else at all, of course. I could say that I'm an independent academic and always have behaved like one. So if you see what I wrote on 20 years ago, it was pretty maverick. I was already writing on things like corruption and cultural quirks of the Chinese and Indians and that kind of thing. Things most other people wouldn't touch with a barge pole. And I've sort of lived in many countries. So I've lived in Saudi Arabia. I know the Middle East, right? After having lived there a couple of years, I've traveled extensively through India, China, Russia, even Eastern Europe. I've written on practically anything to do with culture, wars, geopolitics, right? And of course, economics in that sense trains you to think broadly. It trains you to zoom out, see the bigger picture. What are the driving forces? What are the major actors? What do they want? Get into their skin, and from then on, try and predict things. So I've already for 30 years been predicting things and writing that down in blogs. And the first 15 years you do that, you're usually wrong. You boldly predict, this is going to happen, and then some unexpected event happens, and what you said it was going to happen didn't happen at all, right? For instance, I didn't predict that the current bunch in Egypt would actually succeed in overthrowing the democratically elected government. So I've been wrong much more than right. But of course, if you keep at something, you get to be better at it, right? You start to realize where your blind spots are. You start to take account of the many unknowns, the many things that can happen, and you do better and better and better. So I've been writing books the last couple of years. You can check those. In 2021, I wrote The Great COVID Panic, and I already said, look, from a Western point of view, the Western leaders now need a big war, and it's likely to be one with Russia. Check, right? We're likely to go after the Muslims. Check, right? And also that there was a kind of a geopolitical alliance forming. I've been writing that for certainly more than 20 years, in fact. Yeah. And we now see those geopolitical alliances roughly shaping up as has been long anticipated also by others. So, well, I've got skin in the game. I've done this a long time. I hope I'm getting better at it. And I'm independent. Nobody pays me, basically. I'm one of these idiots who does it because he's interested in it.
Yeah, terrific. One of the things that is topical now, I remember about 10 years ago, you wrote, you were, Club Troppo was a blog back then with Nick Gruen and others. And you made a very insightful comment about how the NDIS, Australia's National Disability Insurance Scheme, worked. And you pretty much said no one seems to be able to explain how they're going to keep costs under control and prevent people just diagnosing themselves and manage these private providers. And you essentially said, from what I can tell, it's going to just turn into a bit of a scam of people loading up and charging the government for things they like. And it's sort of come true. And there weren't that many people 10 years ago saying that. Everyone was swept up in that optimism of, oh, this will help disabled people. And you sat there and said, well, how? Like, who's going to check it?
Mhm.
Who's going to audit this? How are we going to make sure they're not buying themselves stuff? Do you have an overall skepticism of new things that helps in this? Like, I think I've become much more
Mm.
skeptical of social groups sharing emotions and getting optimistic about things. I'm like, oh, we're in for trouble now because everyone's everyone's switched their brain off. Um, do you need that
Well,
sort of
exactly.
critical mindset?
If it's too good to be true, it probably ain't true, right?
Hmm.
There's definitely some of that. Yeah. So like this time, I sort of recognize the nonsense, right? I sort of recognize, okay, if there is this huge government marketing campaign focusing on some kind of hurt, little television stories of this poor disabled person who can't get help, and then okay, the angels appear out of heaven and help her, and she's fine. Well, if somebody pays for that kind of marketing campaign, I sort of get curious, right? Okay,
Mm,
what's actually going on here? How does this work? And then I was lucky enough that, of course, I knew about other countries. In the Netherlands, they tried something like this, these kind of personal budgets, and that became a disaster. And for the obvious economic reason that people are just not fluffy bunnies. This sort of stuff will be abused. Bureaucracies will insist on all kinds of layers. And of course, anybody who can get money just by writing a letter to the government saying, look, I have this and this problem, give me that and then that, you're going to get a lot of letters, right? It might take a while, but you're going to get a lot of
mm,
letters, which is exactly what happened. So yes, it's basically, I guess, a knowledge of the human nature of how bureaucracy works, and then we've seen this disaster before, and from then it was just sort of okay, maybe there's something really special about this program. Maybe they've got some trick up their sleeve that this time it'll be different. And a little bit of digging revealed, nope, nope, nothing different to be seen here at all. If you've got a special trick, you advertise it, right? And instead,
yeah.
none of the people who were doing the modeling had any idea what was going to happen. It was all, trust me, we'll be fine. And the pilots were full of bureaucracy as well. So it was kind of like, no, we won't be fine.
Yeah, so that's all coming to a head now. So you're 10 years sort of ahead of the curve there. We're recording here on the 16th of March, 2026. So I really want to get your view on the unfolding Middle Eastern conflict. It seems like we are getting crazy and contradictory stories every day. I mean, I'm critical, so I've had to switch off because what am I to do? Verify everything to form a coherent view? I've got stuff to do with my day. So it's 16th of March, 2026. Um, I'm hearing oil's going to be $200 a barrel and petrol be $3. I'm hearing, the Americans are way ahead. This will all be over next week. I'm hearing it's all secret. The Americans are way behind, and Iran's got all these missile strikes. How do you make sense of it? Where are you starting on your analysis? Take me through. Have you been tracking this maybe longer than I have? Where were you a year ago? Maybe is the place to start on this. You flagged that you had
Mhm.
this feeling about the
Mm.
US might need a war. Why did I can't think of my question, but we'll get to it. Which is, why did you think the US needed a war, and then where have you gone in
Mm.
your thinking since?
So I guess the story of the Iran stuff starts a little bit with the June war that they had last year with Israel, the thing that lasted 12 days. And the websites that I was following said that Israel was taking a beating by all the sort of hypersonic rockets that Iran was firing at it. They were losing a lot of people, a lot of expensive installations, the petrochemical industry, that kind of thing. And and that they asked the Americans to secure a ceasefire, and then Trump in Iran made a deal. He basically pretended to bomb a major nuclear installation, and they pretended to bomb an American army base in another country. And in both cases, apart from a couple of goats and maybe a flying pigeon, nobody was hurt. And then they both declared victory towards their internal audiences, and it was over. Now
So
that alerted me to a couple of things. Yeah,
hang
go
on.
on.
How do you know this was all, was it staged, is what you're saying? As in they've come to an
Hey, it was
agreement, but we've
staged.
got to
It was
look
staged.
like we've had a tussle. Can't make it look too easy. How do you know
Yeah,
that?
yeah. Well, you can look up these things. So, first of all, the airbase that was bombed by the Iranians in revenge for the bombing of their installations previously pulled out all the Americans from the airbase. And these kind of things you can look up online. Why? Well, they've got to alert Americans who don't know what is going on, right? They might wander back into the base just as it's about to be bombed. So they've got to somewhat on the media say, okay, get out of the way. Well, why do you say that unless you know it's going to be bombed, right? And just that single one, right?
Mm.
Well, that smells like a setup. And then these Iranian military bases, well, I happen to know that, and this you can look online as well, that these things were buried, between 400 or 500 meters of solid rock. You can't scratch these things. There's no way you'll get to them. You need 10 nuclear bombs to get that deep. So it was kind of like, what the frig, right? These things are essentially impenetrable. I'm sure you can have a clever bomb going into the ventilation shaft, but a missile doesn't fly zip, 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 right? So there's
Mm.
not much damage that you can truly do from the air, right? And the fact that there were no reported Iranian casualties, that kind of thing, and the missile and the satellite pictures afterwards were kind of like, oh, that's a nice dent in the mountainside, that's a new camp place for someone. Um,
Mm.
so the websites I followed basically said that was a setup, and later on, various diplomats said the same thing in lots of talk shows, right? So the military analysts, the diplomats, they all knew this, and then they were talking about that very openly, right? As to, well, can we do this time? Can we do that time? So it's a matter of knowing the right websites. It's a matter of paying attention if something strange is being said, right? Is that true? Were these Americans told not to go to the base? Oh, yeah, that is true. And it made political sense at the time. Israel was hurting, internal communications from the Israelis were, oh, geez, we want this to stop, right? These Iranian missiles are much more powerful and accurate than we thought they would be. What's going on? Please stop. And the big surprise was really for me that the Iranians went along with this because they were in a war that the Israelis had started. Half their leadership had been killed in the first few days. And nevertheless, they were okay with this kind of theater to make it stop after 12 days. Well, they're a bit naive, right? I can see why the Israelis want to stop if they're behind, but the Iranians, finally, they're ahead. Now they can push through and they stop. Okay. So it
Mm.
also told me something new. The Iranians are a little bit naive in believing promises of the West and Israel that it won't happen again. And of course, perhaps being from the West myself, I know how we can be in these kind of circumstances, right?
Uh-huh.
Don't trust us. And so it started with that 12-day war in June. And there were various other things, right? There was
And
sort of the fake uprisings in Iran
so can I just,
and sort of the ongoing problems. Go on.
so the fake, this 12-day war and a ceasefire or a truce or an agreement that Iran and the
Mhm.
US came to, you think that was very much not in Iran's favor to do that? Or like
Mhm.
you said they were naive
Yeah.
to do that when they had the upper hand. Would it not, are you suggesting that they thought they had demonstrated some kind of military capabilities that would, if they agreed now, prevent any future sort of fight picking from Israel or the US? Is that sort of how you take that agreement? Like it was naive in the fact that they thought they'd demonstrated their capability and that if they agree to this, then that'll be that. They'll be left alone. Is that what you mean or something else?
Yes, I think that would have been part of their calculations. Indeed, we've shown them how strong they are. They'll surely leave us alone now. And that was naive. That is not the nature of our side, as it were, right? Particularly not the Israelis. And also, it was naive given their history, right? Because they've been fighting the Americans in Israel for 47 years, right? And I happen to know about that conflict. All the time there were Iranian scientists being killed. Their attempts at nuclear reactors for civilian purposes have been bombed several times over the decades. Several wars have been started just to make it difficult for them, like the Iran-Iraq war, in which 1 million Iranians were killed. It's kind of like, what do we have to do to these people to make them realize we are really not on their side and trying to totally destroy them? If we ask for a ceasefire, that's not going to be in your interest. And so, yes, it was kind of like a stunning degree of naivety for me that was revealed in that 12-day war as well. Particularly, of course, because I knew that there was a genocide going on in Gaza, just as there is right at this moment. That the killing continues in a quite sadistic and brutal manner. And so I also knew there was something that they could ask. They could say, well, if you want us to stop, open Gaza, stop this, right? We enact a price. Stop what you're doing with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Stop what you're doing in Gaza. Open those gates and stop interfering. But they didn't do that. So they also didn't ask for a price, even though they were ahead. And I thought, okay, you guys really don't know how to do this. Um, and then it turned out that they themselves came to the same conclusions in the month afterwards. You know, there was sort of messages on social media and by diplomats saying that the mood in Tehran had changed and that they were now realizing that this was a mistake and that next time they would not just hit Israel as they did in the 12-year war, but they would see Israel and the US as one entity. It's basically the enemy, and they have to take them together. And so that they would attack all the US Army bases. They were flagging this in the months beforehand. And they would go after the installations of other countries if they would stand in the way. And that told me that they'd woken up. Okay, okay. So somebody slapped some sense into these people, right? This is not how you do things. And they've reorganized their army, and there were lots of other signs that they were actually preparing.
So I guess if you're the US or Israel after this 12-day war in June, you've orchestrated this ceasefire, you've fake bombed each other, there's no casualties, it all looks good. Why, where's the fight picking motivation after that? Like, um, you know, Trump Trump's first term in the US was, oh, we're no more foreign wars, right? And that was right. But then the second term seems to be as many foreign wars and fights as we want. Where is this coming from the US side? Like, I mean, maybe I'm just too Aussie and I'm like, everyone chill out and relax, you know. Um,
But
what,
maybe the Aussies are a bit naive too, you know, having a beer at the barbecue. Just can't we leave each other alone? That's not
uh,
how world politics goes, right? So
So
world
where is this
politics was that
underlying
okay.
motivation for the
Yeah, yeah,
clear military
yeah.
power to just keep picking fights? And, you know, is Venezuela related to any of this stuff either? Wasn't that or do you think that's just some,
There is, there is, there is,
yeah.
there
Okay,
is.
so
Yeah.
what's your take on my
So
confusion?
let me give a twofold answer. One is, you know, if you're following geopolitics, you got to use your memory. And remember, I just said that Iran had been fighting the US for 47 years, right? So these are long animosities. And part of that is just commercial. Iran has a lot of oil, and there are several American companies who were in Iran and were kicked out with the Islamic Revolution, and they want their oil back. And so they keep pushing American politicians to go back, right? These are American oil companies, not the Zionist lobby, right? The second thing is that Trump became president with the help of the Zionist lobby. Half his cabinet are solidly part of the Zionist lobby. And his history is basically doing what his handlers tell him, right? They just have to
Hmm.
curate a situation which he believes is the hero. So he was also the guy who started the lockdowns. He was the guy who started the vaccine. So he's a pushover. He's weak. I knew that. I know he pretends to be strong, but that is
Hmm.
that is his brand. Brand Trump is that he's in charge. But anybody who's been paying serious attention knows that he always chickens out and is not in charge at all because he doesn't read. He sort of buffoons around and makes empty threats and then forces the rest of his administration to pretend he was right as well. So in that sense, he's sort of like a narcissistic bit of a Dumbo, right? Now, this is clear to anybody paying attention. But of course, that is nobody in mainstream media, right? You know they're not paying attention because They're not analyzing the history of this guy, right? Well, what are the actual decisions he made? Why did he do
Mm.
the lockdowns, which he then said it shouldn't have happened, but he nevertheless didn't put in the order to stop them? Why did he do these vaccines that are? Oh, it's because there was probably a kickback there, and they made money there. And the people around him were sugarcoating him, and meanwhile orienting him towards the decision they wanted. So it was clear that we're going to do this time as well. So the question was not what Trump wanted. The question was what the designers lobby want. Well, as Benjamin Netanyahu himself said, he's been trying to get a war with Iran for 40 years. And he finally had the president who was gullible and sort of vain and uninformed enough to make it happen. So that was part of the impetus. There was a second reason really for the impetus, right? So the Israelis have been wanting this because they want to be the regional boss, and sort of Iran is resisting them. Um, but there is something about geopolitics that is nasty. It is basically a schoolyard, and a schoolyard always has a bully. And Australia knows this full well because Australia is always best friend with the biggest bully. That has been Australia's foreign policy for 150 years, right? And it works, right? You're sort of left alone. You get to have some adventures in Afghanistan and Iraq, a bit of a tequila on the beach. And basically, you're sort of left alone. You now and then have to deal with a bombing like the Bali one when somebody goes for revenge. But by and large, Australians feel pretty happy being the best friend of the bully, right? And of course, if a bigger bully comes, the Australians switch to the bigger bully. So Australians used to be with England, then they turned out not to be so powerful. You switch to the bigger bully. And of course, China's hoping you'll switch to China, right? If it can prove, but you must be a worthy bully. You must prove you're the bigger bully than America, right? Now, in a sense, there has been a divergence in the forthcoming in international politics because internally the US has become weaker and weaker and weaker, and the West has become weaker and weaker and weaker if you look at the right statistics, right? And the right statistics in this sense are not GDP, but more how many arms can you produce? How many soldiers can you actually field in a hurry? How modern are your weapons really? And then don't look at the shows. Don't even look at arms exports. Look at a theater of operations. Look at what arms are winning in Ukraine. Look at the arms that North Korea is producing. Look at what really won, for instance, in the air battle between India and Pakistan last year. So the insiders watch these kind of things, and it's been clear, and I watch that kind of stuff. It's been clear for a long time that the West doesn't have the best weapons, and we've got very few of them. So we were sort of strutting around on the world stage, being the bully and smacking small places like Venezuela around, right? But the reality was we're just not really the biggest bully on the playground anymore. We're now the runt who pretends to be the bully, and that to a certain extent will hit the wall with reality because of course you're still behaving like a bully, so you're still trying to get your way even when you can't. And at a certain moment, somebody in the schoolyard is going to hit you back to a degree you'd never seen coming. And that's what just happened in Iran, right? What used to be the biggest bully on the playground, the US, is being smacked around and is getting a hiding, right? And of course, everybody else is cheering, but we're just waiting for the next bully then, right? And Australia will no doubt then run after that one. But Australia is not yet convinced that America is really taking a hiding. So we got to watch it, and that's
Okay.
it's a smart foreign policy strategy. So we're watching, if you like.
Well, that would be my next question. I get, you know, truth is the first casualty of war. I hear from some people that Iran's got, it's going to run out of missiles. I hear from others that it's got more than America. It hasn't even used its most modern ones. It's just getting rid of some old ones. Um, how do you distinguish what's true and what's not? Like, we've talked about this. I mean, you emailed me some links to certain people, and I've had a look, and I still get the vibe of, I'm not sure I trust any of that either. Maybe I'm too cynical. But I guess, what makes you say that the US is not winning, or nor that they can build out the superior arms? In the Second World War, they also weren't building many ships or planes or weapons at all. But in a couple of years, they ramped up production at an astronomical scale, and were supplying all of Europe with the British designed planes and ships, etc. So what makes you think that that can't happen, given that they have the resource base and the distance from the conflict that Iran doesn't have? They have to sort of ramp things up while being constrained from trade, while the US has this half a continent on the other side of the world to mine for minerals and produce weapons. What makes you
Okay, so those
take
are a
that?
lot of
Yeah.
questions in one. Let
Yeah,
me.
well, I guess respond to my confusion would be my question.
No, no, no. That's no, that's fine. So one
Yeah.
is how can an objective outsider who doesn't know much about this conflict know that Iran is winning? Well, you can look at a couple of things, right? One is look at the rhetoric of the U.S. changing very rapidly in the first days and weeks, right? In the first day, it was, oh, this will be a short war, it'll be over in 2 days. Then it began, well, it'll be over in a week. Then it became, oh, it will be over in 4 weeks. We're already after 2 weeks, and nobody is saying it'll be over in 2 weeks from now, is anybody? In fact, the Americans are mobilizing Marines who will take months to even get there, right? So anybody who, in that sense, reflects a little bit of what is said in the mainstream media will realize, oh, things aren't going as they were planned, right? And for instance, if you pay any attention to what's being said about the Straits of Hormuz, which Iran was closed, then you will realize the same thing. It was first, the Americans, we control the Strait of Hormuz. Then it was, Iran has it, but we can take it back anytime we want. And now what Trump is doing is saying, well, we can't fight Iran on the Strait of Hormuz. We want other people to do it. He's basically given up. And so that is in the mainstream media. All that you need to do is reflect on what is actually being said in the mainstream media. Remember what was said last week, and then make your own deduction. But it does
Mm.
require that you use your memory, and it requires that you reflect, right? Because there's always a new story to grab your attention. But if you reflect on what was said last week or 2 weeks ago, and then okay, things aren't going the way we planned, right? And oil prices are now $100 a barrel. I checked this morning. And before, I happen to know there was $65 a barrel of sort of, the main type of oil that you can get. That's a big increase, right? That tells you the market where, tens of billions of dollars are playing for money. They don't believe that America can sort of unlock the Strait of Hormuz. No, Iran has got this. Then you can look for other objective indicators, right? Which is, well, you can ask yourself, and you can even grok this or put this in AI. Well, in which countries in the Gulf are the Americans being kicked out? So they're leaving their bases. They're telling their own citizens to get out. Well, most of the Gulf countries. Okay. So the Americans are being kicked out of the Gulf, and they can't stop this. All their military bases, and they've got lots of them, can't stop this. Things are not going well for the Americans if they have to leave countries, are they? And then you ask yourself, well, okay, well, these American weapons, how close are they to Iran, right? Well, you can actually look this up on world maps. Where are their aircraft carriers? Where are their ships? Because these things are well recorded so that the ships don't bounce into each other on the
Mm.
on the high seas. They're about 1,000 kilometers away from Iran. That's a long way away. Why aren't they much closer? Because you can fire a lot more of the country if you're next to it than if you're 1,000 kilometers. Your planes are going to go there, come back, go there, come back. Well, why not? Well, because the missiles are keeping them away. So that also tells you, okay, those are damn good missiles, then, aren't they? If they can keep a ship away for 1,000 kilometers, those ship
Mm.
captains are going to be really afraid of your missile. So things are going well, aren't they? Now, then, of course, you're quite right that if you're at the website, even the ones I follow, most of it is dross and no good. So you got to filter. You got to put in a huge effort, right? But if we then go to Iran's arsenal, how can you know something about that? Well, this is
Mm.
again a matter of paying attention and having a memory. So I remember that Hezbollah was said 2 years ago to have 100,000 rockets and drones. 100,000. That was their arsenal. I happen to know that Iran sort of has been supplying drones to Russia for the Ukraine operation. Well, the Ukraine operation is using millions of drones, right? Ukraine also produces a lot of them. Well, and Iran was sort of been the main innovator in drones for a long time. They produce hundreds of thousands of the buggers very easily in big underground cities because there the Americans and Israelis can't bomb them because they've been bombed for decades by the Israelis and the Americans. So they put it all underground in their huge mountains. So a country that can produce hundreds of thousands of drones with no problems, and it is, by all accounts, the Americans and the Iranians only fired a couple of thousand, maybe 10,000 so far. They're not running out. They can probably produce them quicker than they've used them so far. The same thing is true for ballistic missiles. They've been preparing for this war for 20 years. So is it believable that they've got this huge arsenal of old rockets and new rockets? Yes, it is. Yes, it is, right? And we know that they're being helped by the Chinese and the Russians, who are also vastly outproducing the West. Now, then the weakness of the Americans, right? Because yes, you're right. The Americans in the Second World War similarly had no army at the start, but were able to produce one within 2 to 3 years. The first point is, well, yeah, but it did take them 2 to 3 years, right?
Mm.
And Iran should be expected to basically completely get the Middle East and kick out Israel before 2 to 3 years is over, right? So before 2 to 3 years is over, ain't no Israel anymore. So those 2 to 3 years is a bit late, right? It takes a long time to get to the US, but it doesn't take long to get to Israel. That's a short flight, right? So that's one point. It takes a while. The second is, well, look at the US in 1941 versus now. In 1941, the US had a manufacturing base. 25% of their economy was manufacturing in the factories. And the thing about factories is you can make washing machines, but you can also make a missile. It's not that much of a difference. Basically, you need sophisticated tools, people who do that, and you need that for practically anything you make in a factory. So they were able to recommission their factories and make something else. So within no time, they were bringing out tanks and aircraft carriers and aircraft, and they were bombing the Japanese to smithereens who had much less, right? Now look at Iran, right? Iran has put everything underground and has got huge supply lines that we, the West, can't touch. They've got the Caspian Sea, whereby they've got a port towards the Russians, and they've got a railway line up at the northeast of the country to China. So we can't get to that. That's too far even for our bombers to get to. So they get all the supplies in that they need. They become self-sufficient after 47 years of fighting us. They don't need anybody else, and they've been preparing for 20 years. So, and if you reflect on that, and this is out there information, right? So, in 1941, American manufacturing was 25%. Now it's 10%. They got way less, right? They're producing way less. The weapons they're producing is way less. So it'll take them a time to ramp up, probably more than 2 to 3 years this time round, and by then it'll be far too late. And if you know a little bit about this hedge, you realize that practically anything you read in mainstream media is just not true. So I spend very little time on it. I check, okay, what's the bullshit of the day again? Oh yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. What PR company just made a buck coming up with that, right?
Yeah, right.
That's how you start to view that kind of thing. You just don't take it seriously as news. It's
So,
entertainment.
so
Yeah.
can we just get a bit of a lay of the land in the Middle East? Iran has what, 90 million people? It's quite educated. It's got a very rich, developed economy. It's been preparing for war for 4 decades. So it's got an extensive military that has been active in training, investing in weapons for 40 years. It is physically well connected to Russia and China for trade and supplies of resources, etc. Um, in the rest of the Middle East, there's not that many people, right? Like my understanding is, people talking about the United Arab Emirates getting some drone strikes in their buildings. If my memory is correct, UAE is like 90% foreign workers, 10% locals. It's pretty much no military. Is that right? Or very weak relatively. And population wise, I think it's 10 million, 1 million Emiratis, 9 million foreign workers. And then is it Saudi's got 20 million Saudis, 10 million foreigners? Uh, like, Iran is just much bigger than everyone else, right, in the Middle East. Am my numbers right? Just to give people a lay of the land of.
Yeah, yeah, those numbers are pretty good. Turkey is another big one. They'll be around 90 million. Egypt also, but they're not
Uh,
involved in this fight. They're staying out, and Iran is being very careful not to go through them.
and
I
Israel,
mean, the
what's the
combined
population
population
in?
of the other countries is sorry.
What's the population of Israel roughly?
It's about 7 million Jews. That's what you. I mean, it's 10 million, but about 7 million Jews. Yeah, and
Okay.
depends a little bit how you count the Palestinians, right? Because there's about 4 to 5 million of those, maybe a million less now than before because of the genocide. But yeah, around about those numbers, right? But 7 million Jews are working, hence, if you like, for the machinery that produces their military.
Mm.
Um, but look, Iraq is also something like 30, 40 million, Syria, 25 million, Kuwait, Lebanon, Jordan. So combined, the rest of the Middle East that Iran is now trying to subdue is well over 100 million. But indeed, they're nowhere near as militaristic. They've not been preparing, and they're much more vulnerable, right? So a place, for instance, like Saudi Arabia cannot afford to really make an enemy of anyone. So they're not going to fight Iran. They're also not going to fight the US for a very simple reason, right? They they've got two things that are highly vulnerable to anybody who wants to hurt them. They've got a petrochemical industry that you don't need much weapons to basically bomb, and there'll be huge losses, and you'll cripple them for years. Or you can take out the desalination plant of their main capital, Riyadh, where 10 million people roughly live, and the place has to be abandoned because it's just not able to survive without it. So those are two very, very sensitive things that anybody can bomb who has the military means, and both Iran and the US has it. So just looking at that and knowing that means, well, Saudi Arabia is going to sit out this war. It's going to do nothing. Anything else is suicide, right? It's not going to pick a
Mm.
side. And so, what has it said to the Americans? You're on your own, and the Americans themselves have basically said, "Okay, we're out of here because our planes are being knocked out on the tarmac." Right?
Oh.
Um, yeah,
So you think they also want the US to not get not because the US has military bases in Saudi. You don't think they want them operating from there? They're just like, can you guys deal with this elsewhere? Because then we become targets. Is that you think the
yeah.
logical?
Yep, yep. That has now been the calculation, right? And
Mm,
and and you can imagine the way this goes, right? So the Saudis have been allies of the US for a long, long time. This goes back to the
mm,
1930s, basically, right? So they've been long, long time friends, and they've always bought the American war toys, and this has made the American war machine a lot of money, just selling their toys to the Saudis, who then don't do anything with it, but they stare at it and say, "Isn't this airplane pretty?" and that kind of thing, right? It's like having a racehorse, right? That's sort of how that goes. But they don't do much with it, right? It's and yes, they've allowed the Americans their Air Force bases there and that kind of thing. And then suddenly Iran starts to lob all these missiles and drones. And of course, the Americans have been telling you for 20 years that they will knock them out and that they've got this wonderfully expensive system, Patriot, FAD, Iron Dome, David Sling in the case of Israel, right? And so, well, you buy that. What do you know, right? So you've bought some of that as well, and you've put that around your installations. Then, lo and behold, you can't stop anything.
mm,
And your first reaction is these nasty Iranians. So that was the first reaction, right? How dare they? Okay, well, the Iranians take no notice and keep bombing these American installations anyway. After a week, it's sort of like, okay, I guess the Iranians are a lot stronger than the Americans. If we're really nasty to them, they'll hit our oil supply and water. They've already said they would. Okay, well, then the other side, well, you can't protect us. We've been paying you big bucks to protect us. You're not protecting
mm,
us. You're on your own, mate. We're not going to help you, right? If you want to keep using our air bases, fine, but don't cry to us when you're knocked out. We're not going to lift a finger, right? You're on your own, which is what the Saudis said. And anybody with any sense would do the same, right?
yeah.
And this has happened all over the Gulf region. So, apart from Bahrain and indeed the Emiratis, who, for sort of deep political and economic reasons, are more bound to Israel in particular and the US than the rest, who have hence kept resisting, everybody else have thrown up their hands and said, well, we're either not involved, or in the case of Iraq, we're sort of with Iran, right? or in the case of Yemen, right? So there are a couple of allies of Iran, but basically there's no allies of the US left. They've all flipped. And yeah, now it's Israel facing the full might of Iran, basically, and its various allies. And the US is sort of, I mean, if Trump is to believe this morning, he's given up the Strait of Hormuz. They say, well, we can't do it. Well, let's hope somebody else does it. And there is a good chance that, well, he'll be forced to run away from the Middle East entirely, which would be a disaster for the US. It'll happen anyway, but eventually, it looks inevitable.
So, yeah, so predictions is where I want to go then. You think it's inevitable that the US will be basically coming up with stories about why it's leaving and trying to save face on its way out and leaving Israel to be what it is? Or do you think Iran is like, no, we've had enough. We don't want an Israel to exist at all. We've shown dominance. We're on the front foot. Like you said, they were naive before. Why would they then become aggressors now when they'd sort of done a deal what was June last year, 9 months ago? What are your scenarios? Maybe not predictions, but scenarios for the coming year.
Yeah, so I've followed a little bit what the Iranians have been officially saying. And if you look at their war aims, they want American influence out of the region permanently. And they see Israel as an American influence. They see
Mm.
that as a long time threat to Iran. And so their logic is, well, you got to get rid of Israel then, right? And they want reparations from the US and their neighbors for all the damage caused. They're going to get that, right? And they sort of want some kind of security guarantee that the Americans won't come back, which is a guarantee that can only be made if the US does a deal with China or something like that, right? Now, I've got three scenarios. My most likely scenario is basically the total defeat of US and Israel. So the US kicked out of the Middle East, the loss of the petrodollar, it'll have a huge economic crash because the US, your listeners may not know, but is very, very dependent on the fact that oil is bought and sold in dollars. That really makes the Americans a lot of money. And they're going to lose a lot of that to probably the Chinese now. It'll be a petro yuan, maybe, right? So the Americans kicked out of the Middle East and also the physical takeover of Israel, right? I think that Israel
By
can be taken
who? Who
over
will
by,
take it over?
well, there are four armies which would probably be involved, right? One is that Iran has got, at least from what I read, has got quite a few attack helicopters and an air force that is keeping in reserve. And it can sort of, well, it's about 1,000 kilometers. It can sort of sneak up on Israel in the night and do that. Now, not at the moment. The Israeli Air Force is still too dominant, right? But after another couple of weeks or maybe a month of sort of solidly bombing the Israelis out of the sky and all its assets, then, of course, Hezbollah in the north has got maybe 30,000 to 50,000 well trained fighters. They're already taking over some villages and cities in northern Israel. That is not well reported in the press, but that's what they're claiming. And they are bombing the whole of the north of Israel now. So that's another army. Then, of course, don't forget Hamas and its tunnels. Yes, maybe up to 1 million Palestinians have been sort of killed in a genocide, but they will be bitterly fanatic, whoever is left. They probably have a force of several tens of thousands. And then there's the Yemenis. Now, the Yemenis can field 200,000 to 300,000 people. Ansar Allah, they call themselves. And they've been openly saying, look, we're waiting for the moment. We're waiting for the sign. And it's sort of like, well, who are they going to attack? Right? I mean, they could attack Saudi Arabia, but why would they? Right? It's much more
Mm.
logical to think that, well, they're basically waiting for the sign to sort of traverse Saudi Arabia and attack Israel from the south. Now, it's a long way to go, right? So Yemen is a long way from Israel. So the Saudis would sort of have to give permission, but you can imagine the Saudis thinking, "Well, we were involved in a war with Israel 40 or 60 years ago. We're glad somebody else is trying now. Yeah, sure, go through it." And then again, the question is, have they got enough sort of air cover to make it up to Israel? But that's four armies you can bring there, right? And I think I think once that kind of plan is announced and is enacted, then there are lots of other groups, right? So Iraq has quite a few Shia militia, which are already attacking the American bases and basically blasting away for the Iranians. Um, Jordan, next to Israel, half their population is Palestinian, and they've been incensed at the genocide of their families in Israel, right? And so there are lots of other places with militaries or military groups who'd be probably egging to sort of take on Israel if they believe it can be done. And so it's almost more a mindset now, right? It's a region with 400 million Muslims, 7 million Jews, and the 7 million, with the help of the US, have been pressing them out. But Iran has been able to scare away the Americans, kick them out. Well, those 400 million, all they need is the belief that, oh my God, we can we can
Mm.
actually get rid of our common enemy. And we'll fight among ourselves after that, but at least get rid of these buggers now. Right? And so that, I think, is the main scenario that we are looking at and that Iran is aiming for. Right? And that would be, of course, a huge victory for Islam, if you like, really. And also a hiding of the Americans who have lots of face. Now, there is a second scenario which is important to talk about, which is nuclear war, right? So Israel has in the past often threatened European and even
Mm.
American and Australians with the notion that they have buried nuclear bombs underneath their cities, and that should Israel fail, they'll blow up the whole world,
Mm-hmm.
including Sydney, by the way, right? You can look it up, right? Now, these are only rumors and empty threats, but you never know, right? And they call it the Samson option, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they apparently have several nuclear weapons. So they could choose to first throw nuclear bombs on Iran, and maybe later on, if their country is truly sort of having to face unconditional surrender and being kicked out, they might say, "Damn it, we're going to blow up the whole world as well as we can."
Mm-hmm.
Now, that is an important scenario to think about because they can't blow up the whole world. They can do a lot of damage. But I think importantly, Iran would survive this, right? All their military bases that matter are deep in the mountains, and nuclear bombs won't take them out. And nuclear bombs in modern cities do less damage than we think it does. They're no longer the wooden huts of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, right? They'll do a lot of damage, but with 93 million over an area that is as big as Germany, France, and the UK combined, you're not going to take out the whole Iranian population or its ability to wage war. So it'll just incense them further
Mm.
and basically make sure that the destruction of Israel is assured. And the Iranians have got 200,000 engineers, new ones every year. They can generate a nuclear bomb and missiles that can carry all the way to the US within no time, within weeks or months, right? They are that technologically advanced. So if Israel or the US does that, you should expect a return nuclear bomb on, certainly Tel Aviv, certainly Haifa, those kind of places. And if the US is dumb enough to go nuclear, then you can expect one on Washington and New York as well. Um, and so that is a scenario whereby you basically get the outcome of the first scenario, but just a lot more destruction before we get there, right? Iran will still
Wow.
win. The destruction of Israel is even more assured. And the not just will the West then be defeated or the US be defeated, but you have to count millions and millions and millions of deaths depending on sort of how crazy and fanatic the Israelis get at the end. It's a real scenario. You have a lot of discussions about this, and as you said, I've been preparing myself for analyzing the situation for a long time. I wrote a whole piece in November last year in which I really sketched this nuclear scenario as a realistic possibility. And now you can find this anywhere in the mainstream, right? Now minds are waking up. But I think I still think the first scenario is more likely than the nuclear scenario because I think all these militaries have gained this. They knew this beforehand. The Russians will be making threats to the Americans and the Israelis saying, don't go nuclear, or, well, for instance, the Russians could give Iran a nuclear weapon. North Korea could give them a nuclear weapon, right? They could
Mm.
basically credibly threaten with Ben saying, well, then we'll supply them with the means to take revenge on you. And so the first scenario is that it's more likely it might need a coup in Israel to get rid of Netanyahu. Right, it might need some sane heads saying, okay, we're going to get rid of the fanatics, and that might already have happened, by the way. But that's why I now think the nuclear scenario is less likely than I thought it was in November of last year. Now, there's a third scenario. The third scenario is you can fool the Iranians again, right? So some kind of peace agreement, right? I mean, the US has been fooling them several times before with the Obama peace agreement, and then the June one, and then another one. So it's kind of like, well, let's see if they sucker for it again, right?
Hmm.
And Iran is saying they won't negotiate with the US or Israel, but well, maybe there's a weak link in their allies, right? So my suspicion is that Trump will be talking to the Chinese nonstop on the phone these weeks, trying to get them to push their ally Iran towards a ceasefire, because the Chinese are also a little bit naive, right? They sort of believe that we wouldn't do it again as the West. Well, of course we would. And
Mm.
so they're working on the weak link in the alliance. That would be my expectations, and maybe that'll work. So I would think that that kind of ceasefire scenario is what the Americans are working towards these weeks. And if they are successful, then well, we're looking at another round in the future. But I think, yeah, the first scenario is more likely in my estimation now.
Very interesting. I'm well, I hope so. I mean, I hope all the last ones fine seems fine too, right? I guess I wanted to maybe, now that we've laid it out and the history, I want to ask you about the way people seem to quickly fall into line when something happens, like war. One thing I noticed in this conflict is that immediately people in the US, oh, my family's from Iran. This is the greatest thing ever. We're going to topple this religious dictatorship or whatever. Straight away, everyone seems to fall into line. Like this is obviously a great thing to do, and those voices get amplified. Have you noticed that, or is it just me? Is that how does that? Why does that happen? Like it's a bit like Venezuela, right? I heard nothing about Venezuela. Then one day, apparently, the US has gone in and taken out whatever the leader's name I've forgotten. And now everyone's falling into line like, yeah, good on the US. Isn't that great? I'm like, where were you yesterday? How did you suddenly decide today, once it happened, that it was a good thing? Is there a name for this, Paul? Help me
Yes,
understand.
yes, we are a herd animal. That's the short answer, right?
Okay.
We are still, despite our modern clothes and our computers and our internet, we are basically monkeys who live in groups. And everything about us is groupish, right? I mean, the language we speak now is the language of a particular tribe, if you like, in this world, right?
Mm.
And that particularly successful tribe. We're basically speaking a Germanic language right now, right? I won't call it English then. That's a Germanic language, to give it sort of tribal origins. Um, and when this kind of thing happens, then yes, there's truth, and there's what you said yesterday about international law and not attacking defenseless nation. But today, my group is fighting another group. And my group is using its factories and it's using its airplanes and it's using its resources to fight another group. Well, if you're the one who's going to say, but is this a good idea, this or that? Well, then you're not helping your
Mm.
group fight as hard as it can. And you're a traitor, right? And you're in the way of the glorious project of beating the enemy. This makes sense. This is not stupid. This makes sense as behavior. And you can say, well, we shouldn't be in this war. Well, okay, but well, that was yesterday. Yesterday was about preventing the war. Today, your group is in a battle with another group, and then it's a question of whose side are
Mm.
you on? And I'm pretty sure that neither you nor me have any interest of living in Iran, Russia, or China. And so, you know, your tax dollar too is going towards the Iran war, mate. So whether or not you like it, right? We are, as it were, on the same side here.
Mm.
At least when it comes to this notion of okay, we're making an effort to beat the other side. And it sort of doesn't matter who's right or who's wrong. This is just tribal. This is just where do you want to live? Where do you see your own personal future? How do your kids identify? Well, you're stuck. This is the
Mm,
side. Now you can within your side try to be a little bit smart, right? So if you've got the ear of the prime minister, you can whisper, "This ain't a good idea, mate," right? That kind of thing,
mm,
right? But if you're a Joe Blow, if you're a Bruce, if you like, if you haven't got
mm,
any power at all, well, okay, you can sort of a little bit. Well, okay, this is not going well. Should we really do that? Yes, but you can't really go against the group effort because then you're no longer part of the group. So you can be like us, right? Sort of discuss what goes on and say, "Oh, this shouldn't have happened. Oh my God, we're losing." That's fine, right? But I'm not going to fight against Israel or the US. Hell no, right?
mm,
I analyze it, but at the end of the
mm,
day, you and me are part of the West, and our efforts are towards improving the West, right? We've written books about how to have less corruption in Australia because we care about Australia, and similarly, I care about the Netherlands and parts of the West and even America. So we in that sense are part of the same tribe, and trying to help that tribe in another way. But that's the thing. People intuitively feel now is the time to show you with the tribe. And we do. We fall in line. And truth be damned. And any opinion about international law then gets revealed to be not that important, is it?
no.
Because we're tribal before anything else.
So I guess to sort of bring this to a close, I think we got a pretty good idea of your assessment. I don't think this podcast will be released for a couple of weeks, so we'll see which is unfolding. So this will be an amazing chance to test your predictions. But are you financially sort of making bets based on your analysis at all? One of the big, criticisms of economists is, oh, it's very easy to be an armchair economist, but if you have a pretty good feel of how things are going to unfold, you should be able to arbitrage that and make some money. Are you doing that at all? Or what would you do if you put some thought into it?
No, no. There are betting markets actually where you can bet on important outcomes. So, and I watch them, right? So you can bet on the oil market, you can buy oil futures and there bet what's going to happen. And you can go to uh, a website called Polymarket.
Mm,
And there you can, for instance, bet on whether the Iranian regime will survive until the end of June, which is 3.5 months from now. And that betting market gives 3/4 chance. So 75% chance that the Iranian regime will survive another 3.5 months. Well, can Israel last another 3.5 months? It must be doubtful. So that tells you that the betting markets give 75% chance of Iran basically winning this conflict, right? Now, I personally, yes, I take my predictions in that sense seriously. Uh, and of course, there's been, as it were, world uncertainty for a long time now. So how have I reacted to that? I've diversified, right? I'm co-owner with my wife of a castle in Belgium. That's a piece of real estate, a piece of land that won't lose its value, even in dire circumstances. We've got a place to sort of grow food and sort of house ourselves. We've got lots of woods to sort of keep ourselves warm. So we'll be fine physically. We're outside the main cities, so we're out of the line of fire of any nuclear war. And we've got pensions in Australia, so that's far away. That's spread over a continent. We have pensions in the UK where we worked for a while. That's another place. And we have stock market investments in emerging markets. Okay, we're pretty safely spread in terms of our assets over the whole world. Now, of course, if the whole world goes to smithereens, well, we're buggered, but then everybody else is too,
yeah.
right?
Yeah,
So
no,
we're in that sense, we've hedged our bets.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think a lot of people are interested in, where's the oil price going to be in 3 months' time or something. And if it's true, there's a 75% chance the Iranian regime's in power in, just looking at my calendar here, in 3 months. Um, does that sort of imply that the US has backed out or given up or tried to save face or escalated? Are those the
Well,
options? If
it's the US is already backing down in many ways now, abandoning its military bases in the Gulf and putting its ships out of harm's way and basically no longer saying it'll take over the Strait of Hormuz. It's already backed out of that in the last week, right? But of course, the Zionist lobby is still very, very strong.
Mm,
And the US, if it walks away now from the war, will go through a huge recession and a huge loss of face because it'll be clear to everybody in the world, oh, the US ain't as strong as we thought it was. And that'll have severe repercussions, right? I would then bet that a place like Brazil, which has been doing what the US told it to do the last few months, will suddenly become part of the BRICS again. It after all, is the B in BRICS, right? But it hasn't
mm,
behaved that way. It'll start to behave that way again. So it'll lose its territories in Latin America as well, right? If it conspicuously loses, the alliance of the Europeans will change in its balance. It'll probably be kicked out of its interests in much of Asia, right? Like Azerbaijan and Armenia, where it's now building up interest, it'll probably just be kicked out and removed. So the US can't walk away from this without a huge economic recession and an enormous loss of face. So it's really a kind of a
mm,
crashing of the American empire that they're looking at. And that's if they walk away. So the nature of the Americans, in my reading, is that they won't walk away until they've really convinced themselves, okay, there's no sneaky way we can win. So I expect the Americans to keep on bombing Iran and trying to see what happens with that. But they're not really making much of a dent on Iran. That's just the important thing to say. They're not actually bombing Iran all that much, right? And they can't actually hurt it all that much, right?
yeah. I
But
mean,
they'll
for
continue
people
with
who
that.
don't
I hope
know,
it'll work.
for people who don't
Sorry?
know, for people who don't know Iran, the capital Tehran is in the north, which is actually quite
Yeah.
far from the Gulf. How many kilometers is that
Well, it's
north?
over a
You
thousand
know,
kilometers, I think.
yeah, 1,000 kilometers
That's
from the
huge,
Gulf Coast. So the
huge.
idea that you're going to not have ships in the Gulf and somehow be waging an air war on the population centers of Iran, which is now
Mhm.
2,000 kilometers away if you're not in the Gulf, um,
Exactly.
is quite
Exactly.
quite interesting. Yeah, look, it's going to be interesting times. Is there anything else that you think is important for people to know before we wrap up about how things might unfold or how to mm, monitor the situation? I guess is the phrase the kids use. Monitor the situation in an informed way. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to share to
Yeah.
close on that?
Well, I mean, yeah, one of the things that is true for everybody personally is that there is a recession already in being, right? With the oil price shock, with also the shock to other trade, the fertilizers, the gas. Uh, the world is already in recession, and this will hit Australia as well, right? And so Australia is now in recession. Well, there are certain industries who do well in recession. Anything to do with sort of drugs does well in a recession. And most other industries don't do well in a recession at all, right? Tourism is not going to do well. So you can diversify your portfolio in that sense right now and sort of take account of that. And I hope they're doing that at the Treasury, but also individuals, right? And if I were an individual at the height of the war, well, I'd sort of stay away as much as possible from the major cities, right? If the world goes through a nuclear war, it'll hit the major cities, but not the countryside. You'll be fine there, right? So, take that extended holiday and be on the Gold Coast if you like, right? Uh, so that
Sure
you'll
thing.
be safe no matter what, right? That kind of advice. Now, if you want to really be informed with this kind of situation whereby everybody is lying and lots of fake
Mm.
stories are being made up, then there's only one way you can do it. You either find somebody you trust and fly with them blind. And for most people, that's whatever the herd says, right? So that is ABC News and this and that, and just shut down your brain, just go with the flow and forget what you believed yesterday, because it'll be a new story every day, and just go with it and don't even don't even find it a bad thing that you're basically not thinking about. But if you want to do it in an informed way, you got to put in a lot of effort. You got to take it serious. You got to have memory. You got to analyze. You got to think, hang on, da, 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 da. You got to start to learn. Okay, who is right about what? What are the trustworthy sources of information on what? You got to start filtering. It's a job. I think for most people that's too much work, so they won't do it. So they'll go with the flow. But if you're serious, well, take it serious.
Mm. Very interesting, Paul. Look, I appreciate your time. We'll definitely find out how things progress, and I guess by the end of the year, have a pretty good idea if you've called this one correctly, which of your scenarios. Um, Appreciate your time, and we'll definitely stay in touch as things unfold.
Definitely. Good to speak to you, Cam.
Thanks very much, Paul.